Okay, this video is the sugar, fitness, and fat question. Is it okay to put a little bit of sugar on your food? What about all these athletes who say sugar is a stimulant that improves athletic performance? What about these expert doctors like Dr. Johnson and Dr. Lustig that say sugar is really bad and causes diabetes and obesity? Okay, it all started, I've heard this off and on, and I'm pretty busy, so I'm not focused on sugar right now. But anyways, here's a patient question. He says, what's wrong with table sugar? And then he also says, what if I'm chelating iron and donating blood? Does that make a difference? And then here's the line that got my attention. The so-called best doctor in the world should know this. I said, you are a difficult patient. I'm going to have to refer you to psychiatry. Just kidding. He does not need a chemical lobotomy from psych drugs. Okay, and here's how my response was. Kempner liked table sugar because it had no nitrogen, only protein, and only protein has nitrogen. There's no nitrogen in fats and carbohydrates because he had a lot of kidney failure patients, especially initially. That was a huge amount of his patients. Also, in sugar, there's no fat, so you don't get the blood sludge effect. There's no sodium, so you don't get the vasoconstriction effect, and that's good for your hypertension patients. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. It tastes good. It gets people to eat plant foods that they otherwise wouldn't eat. But what are the pitfalls of table sugar? Number one, it's bad for the teeth. Number two, there's a risk of rebound hypoglycemia. The pancreas overreacting, thinking the bolus is going to continue, and it stops, and then that drives your sugar too low, and that can cause fainting, syncope. It can cause a problem if you're driving. It can cause a problem if you're on diabetic medicines. It can cause a problem if you are operating heavy machinery or something. You can pass out. Okay, empty calories. It can cause bad behavior. I talked about that before and all that stuff about people on parole and having rebound hypoglycemia is associated with bad behavior. Number three, empty calories. It's a wasted opportunity to get more nutrients, things like dietary fiber and whatnot. There's no fiber in sugar. Okay, non-organic sugar can be sprayed with glyphosate. For example, sugar beets that are non-organic, sprayed with glyphosate. If it's made from corn, that's sprayed with atrazine. So you definitely want to get your sugar organic. White sugar is 50% fructose. 50% fructose, 50% glucose to make sucrose. Large amount of fructose, when eaten, will increase the risk of fatty liver. Fructose, remember F for fructose, F for fat. It starts causing problems. I did a more detailed lecture of all about fructose metabolism called the fructose debate. If you want to see that, it's the fructose debate. Here's a link to it. Large amounts, I'll put a link down below. Large amounts of fructose tend to get converted into fat. That guy Lustig, that pediatric endocrinologist guy, is pretty popular. He made a real famous talk, The Bitter Truth About Sugar. He said that fructose is basically alcohol without the buzz, and alcohol causes fatty liver. Okay, so alcohol is 2 carbon units. Fructose comes in as 3 carbon units, but one of them gets removed. Okay, to make acetyl-CoA and to make fat in the liver, fatty liver. Okay, fructose comes packaged with fruits. Fruit fructose comes packaged with good things like fiber and nutrients, antioxidants, and all that. Whereas white sugar is just the sugar, glucose and fructose, to make sucrose, half and half of each. High fructose corn syrup is often about 65% fructose. It's often contaminated with HG. I know that Kempner's patients did not tend to become fat even though they were given sugar, but that's because his patients also, the ones on weight loss diets, were calorie restricted and they were in a monitored setting. His other patients were given sugar to help them gain weight, so it was to help them gain weight because they weren't able to keep on their weight when they ate it without the sugar. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into a bunch of interesting stuff, interesting papers and whatnot. So first of all, here's the famous Durian Rider, and he says sugar is the best stimulant for your muscles and your DONG, your Johnson. Okay, and look how skinny he is. He says, look at me, where's my fatty liver? Where's my sugar-induced obesity? And he says he eats lots of sugar. And he says his girlfriends do too, and they're all skinny and they walk around in their bikinis. Now here's this guy by the name of Kipchoge. He's the world record holder in the marathon, and he ran a marathon in less than 2 hours. And he said that what he likes to eat before his races is he drinks a giant container of iced tea and he fills it up with sugar. Okay, so you got to remember this guy's running 26 miles at a super fast pace. And so he's got the caffeine. Durian Rider also said that caffeine stimulants improve endurance sport performance. And it's coupled with the sugar, sort of like Durian Rider. He's basically agreeing with Durian Rider. But again, this is a guy, running as fast as he can 26 miles. This is not the average person who works at a desk job and just tries to get a little exercise on the stairs or, at the Heli Club on the way home. They don't work out like these guys do. This is Lustig. Oh, these guys, this is Johnson. He's like a nephrologist who studies sugar, and they basically say that sugar is the devil. Part of what I think is going on is I think these guys promote the meat industry, so they blame everything on sugar, okay? And they say, why are pediatric patients more obese than ever, more fatty liver, more diabetes type 2? And they think it's because of the fructose. And they also notice that fructose leads to elevated blood uric acid. And they talk about how the effects of fructose and the increase in fatty liver and the increase in blood uric acid associated with eating fructose cause a lot of problems for people. Okay, and here's a slide, and this is fat chance. I think this is Dr. Lustig, and he's saying that a significant amount of diabetes he thinks is explained by sugar. The only thing is you have to be careful when somebody says sugar, because what are you talking about? Starch is a polymer of glucose, okay, wrapped in fiber. So, one sugar is glucose alone, and glucose is the energy of life. It's the product of photosynthesis. It's what our brain wants to burn. Whereas fructose is something very different, okay, and sucrose is a combination, half and half fructose and sucrose. So one has to be careful with it. You can't just say sugar, because otherwise, and then high fructose corn syrup is a sweetener. All right, so here's a guy by the name of Chris Knob, and he's another one of these guys who promotes the paleo diet. A lot of his lectures, he gets invited to speak at the paleo meetings. And the point I'm going to say here is, so he tends to blame everything on omega-6 cooking oils. Where his school of people is coming from is they want to try to vindicate and say that saturated fat's not that bad. So he's sort of basically saying sat fat is not the problem. The real problem is the intake in omega-6 cooking oils, and the increase in diabetes corresponds to that. It doesn't really correspond so much to the intake of sugar, as in table sugar, okay? But what he's not showing you is high fructose corn syrup came along around in these times, and there is a big uptake in diabetes and obesity at that, with going along with that. So here's Chris Knob continuing. He says, look at the curve for oils. He says the curve for omega-6 cooking oils, corresponds as good as it's going to get with obesity, and he thinks that's the main culprit. He doesn't think it really correlates to sugar that much. But again, high fructose corn syrup came out around this time in bigger amounts, so I don't think it's that simple. Omega-6 cooking oils lead to this toxic aldehyde. They undergo lipid peroxidation. They have a byproduct called hydroxynonenal, HNE. That inhibits intermitochondrial membrane, and so that's associated with increased risk of diabetes, decreasing your energy. It can also damage beta cells in the pancreas, contribute to causing obesity. That's part of the Tetsumori Yamashima theory, the Japanese MD PhD guy. Okay, so real quick summary of what's the point of the difference between glucose and fructose. Glucose is the energy of life. It goes throughout the body and it feeds the brain, the red blood cells, and just about everything else, okay? Not everything else, but most things. All right, fructose, when you absorb it from your gut, it goes to your portal vein, and almost all of it goes to the liver. Now, the metabolic pathway to break down glucose and fructose is glycolysis, but here's the difference. Glucose comes in right at the beginning. So glucose comes into the cell right at the beginning, gets phosphorylated, and then a key reaction is the second phosphorylation, and the enzyme is PFK, phosphofructokinase, and that's very, 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 very tightly regulated. So you only run glucose down this pathway if you need to. Whereas fructose enters midway at the 3-carbon phase after all these regulatory steps. So when you drink, let's say, a high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage, energy drink, whatever those things are, you get this giant bolus of fructose to the liver, and there's no fiber to slow it down. There's no antioxidants. It just enters at the 3-carbon phase, gets split in half, enters at the 3-carbon phase of glycolysis, and rapidly gets made into pyruvate. And the liver has nothing to do with it, so it just tends to make it into fat. So when you have a big bolus of fructose and you're not in the middle of exercise, the liver makes it into fat. You get fatty liver. And then that fatty liver increases your risk of diabetes. Fatty liver is kind of like pre-diabetes to diabetes of the liver. Okay, you're also, actually I want to show here too, you're also going to make uric acid here, and that's going to be important. Okay, here's just a little more information. The uric acid, so the ADP that's used to phosphorylate, put the initial phosphate on fructose when it enters a liver cell, is then metabolized, degraded into uric acid that goes into the blood, and it does all kinds of bad things. It increases sympathetic autonomic nervous system, so it contributes to hypertension because it'll increase cortisol and catecholamines like adrenaline. It functions as a bridging molecule to stick red blood cells together, so it causes some blood sludge. It inhibits endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which can cause vasoconstriction, and especially in the muscles that's relevant because it means the insulin can't get to those inactive muscle cells, so that means they can't take up glucose to make more glycogen, so that causes insulin resistance. And then that causes other problems. Uric acid also is a little bit prothrombotic. It stimulates platelet aggregation, so it causes a significant amount of trouble. And the fatty liver can lead to then some fat being released into the blood in the form of triglycerides or very low density lipoproteins. So these are all bad things. Normally when insulin binds a cell, it sends a signal from the cell plasma membrane receptor to vesicles in the cytoplasm to travel up the plasma membrane. These are glucose type 4 transporters. And then they just interpose themselves in the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell, and that allows glucose to come in. That's what's normally supposed to happen when you eat a meal and there's glucose there. Excess dietary fat can inhibit electron transport in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and that's the main cause of diabetes, especially sat fat. Here's what happens when you have insulin resistance. You'll get a blockage of the message to send the glucose type 4 transporters up to the plasma membrane. So insulin binds, but these are blocked from going up the plasma membrane because there's a so-called, we'll just call it the overnutrition signal due to the sat fat or the fat causing reversal of electron transport in the mitochondria. It is, in a sense, what it's saying, the cell is, I've got too many calories in here to process, I can't handle it, I don't need any more, forget about sending me any glucose. And the glucose type 4 transporters do not get sent up to the plasma membrane. So they stay in the blood, and that's why you get high blood sugar after eating when you've got insulin resistance. And fat's the main thing that causes that. So a couple things too. Fructose is much more aggressive for causing advanced glycation end products than is glucose. But the fructose is just present in very small amounts normally in the blood. Its plasma concentration is only 1% of glucose, but it's 10 times more likely when it is present to cause a AGE, advanced glycation end product, and it can potentially cause intracellular advanced glycation end products in cells where its concentration is high. A couple more bad things about fructose. It doesn't satisfy hunger that well, okay, because it doesn't raise blood glucose, for example. Fructose promotes fatty liver. 25% of fructose was associated with causing increased fatty liver. So short-term high fructose intake is associated with de novo lipogenesis and liver fat. Yeah, it gets made into fat by the liver. Fructose, but not glucose in this study, comparing them, caused fatty liver, increased blood cholesterol, and insulin resistance. So glucose was good, but the fructose was not. It caused problems. And we talked about how fructose is often 65%. High fructose corn syrup is often 65% fructose, so it's not the same as table sugar. It's got more fructose. Okay, normal endothelial cell makes a lot of nitric oxide, and that's good. It's a vasodilator. It causes smooth muscles to relax. It's a gas. It goes into the lumen, causes the platelets to be antithrombotic. Okay, so that's what you want it to do. But the uric acid is going to block this nitric oxide production, so it's going to make the blood more prothrombotic, and it's going to prevent vasodilation. Dietary fructose causes increased uric acid in the blood. Uric acid inhibits enos, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, meaning it decreases nitric oxide in the blood and in the blood wall, so you get insulin resistance, and you also get vasoconstriction. It's bad, and that leads to you can't open up the muscle capillary, so the insulin can't get into the inactive muscle because of the vasoconstriction from the uric acid-induced blockage of nitric oxide synthase, thus reducing nitric oxide. So you get a buildup of glucose in the blood. Okay. So excessive dietary fructose causes fatty liver, and it also causes insulin resistance. Okay, it also has an effect excess fatty liver from the uric acid that's increased to cause increased activation of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. And so, in addition, its blockage of enos, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, means that it will increase the risk of hypertension. This is just showing some of the side effects of excess fructose intake. De novo lipogenesis to cause fatty liver, elevated uric acid in the blood. Okay. This is just a little more detail on what we already talked about. By inhibiting endothelial nitric oxide, the uric acid from the fructose ingestion causes vasoconstriction in skeletal muscle. That causes insulin resistance. That leads to increased glucose persisting in elevated levels in the blood. Let's see. It also causes increased sodium resorption from the gut. That also contributes to hypertension. And it stimulates increased sodium retention in the kidneys. Again, these things increase blood sodium, and that'll cause hypertension. It activates platelets too, so it's prothrombotic. Okay, ingestion of carbohydrate prior to and during a sprint. So if an athlete is just running a sprint, that's a short distance race, there is no benefit to eating carbohydrates immediately before the competition. Ruth Heidrich here, she's a very famous lady. She's a PhD, smart lady. She's written several books. And she had metastatic breast cancer, became a low-fat vegan, was a patient of Dr. Mcdougall. She said talking to Dr. Mcdougall for 2 hours was enough to convince her to become a vegan right then and there. Anyway, she's competed and won a whole bunch of triathlons and marathons, and she says all she does is just load up with fruits the night before to load her glycogen. Here's another guy, Michael Arnstein. He's an ultra-marathoner, and he describes himself as a fruitarian. He even moved to Hawaii. Ruth Heidrich lives in Hawaii. He moved to Hawaii because it was more convenient there to eat a lot of fruit. Okay, here's something about how much glucose or other sugar should an athlete take before competition. Remember that Kipchoge would just pour a whole bunch of, my understanding was it was table sugar, meaning half and half fructose and glucose into his iced tea before competing. What this article is saying is that you can get up to 60 grams per hour of glucose absorption if you just supplement with glucose, but you can get higher amounts if you use a half and half mixture of glucose and fructose. So the gut can only absorb 60 grams of glucose per hour in general. But if you take fructose and glucose, the gut, because they're absorbed through different uptake mechanisms, you can absorb more of the two and thus get a higher total amount of sugar ingested. And that's especially relevant if you're running marathons in the mountain or these ultra marathoner events. Okay, here's fructose glucose composite carbohydrate. So combining the two of them. So let's say you can only get 60 grams per hour ingestion of glucose. Well, you can get a similar amount of ingestion of fructose. So you combine the two and you get more sugar coming in fast. And they think that might be beneficial. It probably is for long distance runners. So like here's one study that showed if you took 120 grams of sugar per hour in these like mountain marathon super endurance events, that they recovered better from it. Didn't necessarily sound like it did much for their performance, but I'm not going to get into the performance stuff because I haven't studied that in that much detail. But what was emphasized here was they had better recovery, less exercise-induced muscle damage. Okay, so the recommendations for the amount ingested, if you're only taking 30 to 60 grams per hour, you could do that all with glucose. Okay, but if you're going to take more than that, like get to 90 or even 120 grams per hour, you're going to have to use at least two different carbohydrates like glucose and fructose. Now, glucose is absorbed from the gut with what are called sodium-glucose-linked transporters. So they need a little bit of sodium, and it creates a sodium gradient, and that's coupled to pumping glucose into cells. Okay, here's one thing a little bit interesting. This is a guy, young guy, 15-year-old, who ran a marathon, and it made him hyponatremic, meaning it dropped his blood sodium. His blood sodium dropped below 135. You also get elevations of creatine, LDH in the blood, and that's from the muscle damage related to running, 26 miles. But the point I'm saying is he did become hyponatremic. You're going to sweat a lot. And if he was only drinking fluids, I guess, we'll just assume he's just drinking water. You're not going to replace that sodium. I'll show you this one guy here. This is a pretty famous guy. This is Stan Efferding. His nickname is the White Rhino. He was sort of a bodybuilder and a power lifter. Very strong guy, and he's a pretty nice guy. But the reason I show him is he had mentioned, he was out in Las Vegas in a competition, and he said that he was, having suboptimal performance, but he ingested a little sodium, and then he did a lot better. But it was in Las Vegas. It was like 100 degrees outside, and he was sweating like crazy. But I simply bring up this. There is a rationale to wanting some sodium to be a part of your competition's, drink when you're running a marathon, because it's part of absorbing your glucose. Okay, so he said after he had the salt, then his performance dramatically improved that day. So he always thinks that part of your pre-workout there should be some sodium in it. Okay, so I'm going to end right there. So the bottom line, what I'm basically saying here is a little bit of sugar sprinkled on your food, it's okay. That'll get you to eat healthier. I personally don't do it, but Dr. Mcdougall said, yeah, you got to let people put a little sugar and a little salt on the outside of their food. Otherwise, they won't eat the plant foods. Okay? Now, that's for a regular person, which is the vast majority of the population, 99% of the population. And they really shouldn't be eating too much sugar because they can run into problems of having excessive amounts of fructose. Okay? On the other hand, if you're a competitive athlete and you're just trying to get enough calories into your system, as was shown here, there's an argument to be said that you're limited to 60 grams per hour of absorption on the glucose. So if you take a little more fructose on top of that, that is actually shown to improve recovery and perhaps increase performance a little bit. So in that context, it could be okay. Again, I would definitely get organic so you're not getting GP sprayed stuff with sugar beets. Anyways, I hope that was helpful.